The leader of the Irish nationalist movement in the first half of the 19th century was Daniel O'Connell. Today, O'Connell is remembered across Ireland as the liberator, the great champion who brought in Catholic emancipation in 1829. Although in some ways he also has a bit of a mixed reputation because he failed with his second campaign, the campaign to repeal the Union. And some blame him for not resorting to violent means. And perhaps they think Ireland might have won her freedom an awful lot sooner. But O'Connell was someone who believed in the constitutional nationalist tradition, partly because as a young student he had witnessed the mob violence in France after the revolution there, but also he had seen the incredible violence in 1798. And he feared any rebellion that would be crushed, where you would see so many Catholics being just led out and massacred, and he just could not stand over anything like that. Certainly O'Connell never doubted his own place in the pantheon of Irish nationalist heroes. Later in his life, when he was asked who did he think was the greatest figure in Irish history, he would answer confidently, Henry Grattan, before adding, after myself. And he adored Henry Grattan and that period 1782. He idealised it. He imagined it as being this glorious period when Ireland had been free as prosperous. And after the winning of emancipation, he loved travelling around the countryside. When he'd meet school kids, he'd ask them, do you know who I am? And if they didn't, he would say, I'm the man who won you your freedom. And sometimes now in the 21st century, I think that we really don't recognise how significant an achievement Catholic emancipation was. Because the country in Ireland has become less secular, and there isn't really, it's not seen as that meaningful. Why did it matter if Catholics could suddenly sit in Parliament or become judges or become senior councils, king's councils? Why did that really matter? Well, it mattered an awful lot. Because when O'Connell would look around Ireland, he saw an Irish nation, an Irish people that were broken down by centuries of defeat. Not just recent defeats like the 1798 rebellion and Emmet's rebellion, and the Act of Union, but centuries of defeat, going back hundreds of years. And he said that whenever you walked through a street, you could always identify the Catholics. They were the ones who refused to make eye contact. They were the ones who would crouch over with the bad posture. They were the ones who were broken down, ashamed. They were the ones who were defeated. And the campaign for Catholic emancipation, which he led between 1800 and 1829, leading the world's first mass democratic movement in the 1820s, was a campaign that energised the Irish Catholics, that raised them from their knees, that convinced them that they were more than slaves. There were lines of Lord Byron that O'Connell always loved to quote whenever he would give a speech, whenever he would address the Irish people. There were lines that said, hereditary bondsmen know ye not, who would be free, themselves must strike the blow. What he was saying is that he was saying to the Irish people, you are slaves, but you know what? You deserve to be slaves unless you play a part in fighting for your own freedom. You can't rely on nice people in England to give you your rights. You must get involved, otherwise you might as well stay as slaves. You deserve to stay there. It was his challenge, his exhortation to the Irish Catholics to rise themselves out. And that was his great achievement in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. And perhaps an achievement that hasn't really been given the full credit in this country, in Ireland, that it deserves. Although ironically enough, he became a great champion, as we'll see, across the world for his leadership, for his campaign against slavery, for all the things that he did. So he was born on the 6th of August, 1775, from a very poor family in County Kerry. He believed that the year of his birth was significant because it was right at the start of the American War of Independence, and he liked to suggest that this coincidence shadowed forth his destiny as a champion of freedom. As a young boy, he loved hearing the accounts of the winning of legislative independence in 1782. There was a story that he was there with his family looking out of the window while one of the great discussions of what was happening was going on. And his aunt turned to him and she said, "Dan, you've been very quiet. What are you thinking?" And he turned around and he said, "I'm thinking that one day I'll make a stir in this world." He was convinced that he would write his name on the page of history. Now, his family wasn't very rich, but his uncle was. His uncle was a smuggler and a landowner, had the name of Hunting Cap because he wore a soft felt cap because they brought in a tax on more elaborate fancy hats and he refused to pay the tax. So Hunting Cap saw that this was an intelligent young boy and decided to invest in his future, in his education. Now, up until 1793, Catholics couldn't receive an education in Ireland, so he sent him abroad. He sent him to France and he sent him to Belgium. And years later, when the Belgian Parliament voted in 1830 on who they should have as the king of their country, 3 parliamentarians voted for Daniel O'Connell because they were so impressed with what he had done in Ireland. Years later, the French said, "Oh, it's a pity he wasn't born here instead of just having studied here. We would have made him the king of the French." They're examples of how his international reputation went around the world. So he studied in France, he studied in Belgium, and from there went to England, where after 1793 he was allowed to study as a lawyer, so he decided to become a lawyer. And he trained to become a lawyer. But he also trained to become an orator. He was determined to become a member of the Irish Parliament. That was his lifelong ambition. And so he went to the House of Commons and he studied the orators. He studied the Prime Minister, William Pitt. And he was impressed with how Pitt could be heard from the back of the public galleries. He never looked like he was straining his voice. He never shouted, but yet he projected beautifully. And O'Connell began training his voice so that he could project in the same way. He began going to the theatre, and afterwards he would go home and rate the actors and the actresses. But he wouldn't rate them in terms of their acting ability. He would rate them in terms of how well they could be heard. Could you hear them from the cheap seats? And he began copying them, studying how to project his voice. And he grew into this great orator. Now, O'Connell was a tall man. He was over 6 foot tall. He had a big build. And people sometimes look at that and say, that's why he was such a powerful orator. That's why his voice projected. No. O'Connell was a great orator because he trained that way. When Orson Welles was 16 years old, he visited Dublin. He travelled around the west of Ireland and then presented him to the Gate Theatre in Dublin, to the 2 impresarios, Micheál MacLeamore and Hilton Edwards. And he said, "I am the great Orson Welles from America. I'm a famous actor. I want to star in your productions." And they said later that they knew he was a boy, but they were impressed with him. And they wrote afterwards about how, even though he was just a boy, his voice was fully developed. It was like the voice of a preacher. It was like the voice of a god. Well, that was like Daniel O'Connell. That is how he developed as an orator. And he developed into this powerful orator. So much so that when he bought a house at Merrion Square, overlooking a huge green area with houses on each side of the square, when crowds would gather to hear O'Connell speak, he would deliver an oration from the balcony, and you could hear every word perfectly from the houses on the other side. An incredible thing. And that was because he put so much effort into training his voice. He also studied to become a lawyer, studying the law until he knew it backwards. Now, in his younger days, he was quite reckless. He was quite dissolute. We have stories of him chasing women in London, drinking a lot, getting into all kinds of scrapes, much to the annoyance of his uncle Hunting Cap. And he returned back to Dublin, where he was called to the bar in 1798, but then fled Dublin, fearing he would be arrested because he had joined the United Irishmen and was developing a name as a revolutionary. And afterwards then, he came forward in 1800 to oppose the Act of Union. And it was his maiden speech in January 1800. And just before he was about to give the speech, Major Sir, who would later arrest Emmet, called to declare the meeting illegal. And the troops with their rifles came in. And O'Connell said, "No, here's the legal cert. I'm a lawyer. I investigated. This is allowed. We can do it. So Sir had to back down and the speech continued. And O'Connell began his speech and he said, my cheeks were flushed. I was blushing. I was so nervous. But as I went on, I realised my voice was holding firm. It was going well and I grew in confidence. And he would grow in confidence for every other speech. But the great thing about him as an orator is that he always analysed his speeches afterwards. He would always write in his diary or write to his wife, because he married a penniless distant relative in 1802, much to the disgust of his uncle, Hunting Cap, who wanted him to marry a rich widow. But O'Connell took one look at the rich widow and said, she's ugly, I don't like her, refused. Eloped with Mary O'Connell, had a very happy marriage with her, and his uncle cut him off. And O'Connell said, I don't care, I'd rather be poor and happy than rich and miserable. And in the years to come, he won back his uncle and he got the inheritance back. But it showed that he was determined to be his own man. Well, O'Connell put a lot of thought into his speeches, would analyse them afterwards, and you still see him putting that effort in years later. His first major speech in England was in 1825. And this was at a time when they thought the British Parliament would pass Emancipation. And so he went over to deliver a series of speeches to rally support. And he was going to give a speech in a huge theatre that could hold 3,000 people. And all the English Catholics and all the English media were gathered to report on it. And the evening began, but none of the speakers could be heard. Everyone had to stand. It was very hot. They got very cranky. And then they called on O'Connell to speak. And O'Connell said, no, don't worry, you can sit down, you won't have any trouble hearing me. Went to a pillar and spoke from there. And he delivered a brilliant speech, began by making fun of all the other speakers for not being able to be heard, and went on and delivered a great speech. Now, why were they able to hear him and they weren't able to hear the others? Because O'Connell had gone into that theatre the night before with 6 of his friends to test the acoustics. And he'd positioned them at various points in the hall and said, can you hear me from here? Can you hear me from there? Can you hear me from there? And kept doing that until he found that there was one spot where he could be heard from, in front of that pillar. And that's where he spoke from. And what that story illustrates is that there at the age of 50, O'Connell wasn't resting on his great reputation as an orator. O'Connell was doing as much homework and preparation into it. He knew that the victory was in the preparation and he was determined to make a success. And that's why he was so strong an orator in the 19th century. His speeches were very different, though, from the speeches of Henry Grattan. Henry Grattan, as we said before, wasn't a debater. He learned off his orations. They were beautiful sentences. They were more like poetry than prose. O'Connell wasn't famous for any memorable sentences. He just captured the mood of the audience. He would have them laughing one minute and crying the next. He could control the emotions of his listeners. He would tell jokes. He would tell sad stories. He would use very aggressive language. And sometimes that aggressive language would shock his listeners. Sean O'Faolain, writing in the 20th century, said that Irish good manners were destroyed by Daniel O'Connell's oratory. That we had moved away from the great oratory of Grattan and Emmet, and that O'Connell had led to something that was a little bit more vulgar. And what he meant was that O'Connell offended people, even his own side sometimes, with the vehemence of his language. I'll give you one example. There was a speech that he gave in 1812, shortly after the assassination of the British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval. Spencer Perceval was the only British Prime Minister in history ever to be assassinated. And Britain went into mourning. Ireland went into mourning. He'd been shot in the lobby of the House of Commons by a deranged stockbroker. Ireland went into mourning. There was a huge event in Dublin to mark the occasion. And O'Connell stood up and he said, "Why are you people crying? Why are you people crying for that dead man? You didn't know him and he did nothing for you. He didn't care about you." But let me tell you a story of the widow Byrne. This is a woman who had only her son to look after her in her old age. And that man was murdered by 2 Orange men, 2 defenders of the ascendancy. And those soldiers were put on trial and they were found guilty and sentenced to death. And the Lord Lieutenant, he pardoned them and they went free. So who is there to look after the widow Byrne now in her old age? No one. It was the judgment of God that struck down Spencer Perceval in revenge for what had happened to widow Byrne. That was God's judgment. How dare you cry for Spencer Perceval when you will not shed a tear for that poor woman? And he won the crowd over. He shocked them out of their mourning for Spencer Perceval, and they cried for the poor widow Byrne. But others were shocked by his language. And they went to him and they said, O'Connell, you will never achieve anything as long as your language is so violent. And years later, he liked to tell that story. And he'd say, well, what did I do? I became more violent in my language, and I succeeded.